Broadcasting live from our studio in Boston, Solutions Review is proud to showcase Datto in the Solutions Spotlight, a unique online event for industry professionals.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome to the Solutions Spotlight focused on maximizing your cybersecurity, featuring Datto RMM and Datto EDR. Endpoint detection and response is one of the most searched subjects on Solutions Review today, and it's no secret why. As many as 77% of advanced threats bypass up-to-date antivirus products. An EDR solution enables you to detect and respond to sophisticated attacks through built-in continuous endpoint monitoring and behavioral analysis. However, one of the keys to maximum cybersecurity is combining detection and response with a remote monitoring and management solution as well. That RMM element works on initial threat prevention by automating critical routine tasks such as software updates, maintenance, and patch management, ensuring that all your systems and applications are up to date and secure. And joining us to walk you through the Datto RMM and EDR solutions is an expert in implementation in this space, Mathew Smith, Senior Solutions Engineer. Matt, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Doug.
Well, I'm glad you're here because I really think that you are going to be able to offer a very interesting walkthrough, but also your perspective comes from a lot of experience, not on the solution side, but on the implementation side. Before we dive into all of what you're going to show, can you just walk us a little bit through your background and the path you've taken to be here today?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the IT space, industry space for, 26 years plus, something like that. Quite a long time, right? So, when I started, we were dealing with Windows 3.11 and Novell networks. That's kind of how far back this was, right? And I've been working for several MSPs and internal IT for a university as well. So I've been through sort of first line support, second line, third line, field engineering. And I eventually ended up at a really big MSP over here in the UK, managing the back end sort of team, the guys that were managing the RMMs, the backup softwares, the antivirus products, right? All the kind of stuff that has to happen, but the users aren't necessarily aware that this stuff is going on. So all the background sort of tasks. So I've seen various RMMs and various technologies from both a customer perspective, but also now internally at Datto as well.
Well, and I want to let everybody know that you have a great resource here to ask questions of, and we encourage you to ask some questions. So by all means, submit some questions while Matt's going through his presentation. They'll come to me, and I'll catch up at the end of the presentation, and we'll save some time to have a Q&A with Matt. But I don't think there's probably a better person to give perspective on some of the questions that you may have than Matt, from all of the angles that he can bring responses from. Without any further ado, I'd say, Matt, why don't we turn it over to you? I'll be here listening. I'll jump back in as you wrap things up, and as I said, we'll jump into a Q&A and go through any questions that anybody has. But otherwise, looking forward to hearing more about what you've got to present.
Sure, perfect. Thanks very much. So, before we dive into Datto RMM and the EDR, I just want to kind of talk about the current scene. Where we've seen MSPs and internal IT departments, right? So security generally is quite a complex set of tools that MSPs and IT engineers in general need to manage, right? And it's quite often hard to understand. It's quite hard to configure sometimes, and it's quite hard to deploy. And so we've got a lot of stuff happening, and we don't necessarily have the engineers trained to the levels that we want, right, from an internal perspective, MSPs, IT departments. So what we're going to look at in Datto RMM here is we've got some quite complex topics to look at, but what we've done is put a very easy, simple UI on the top of it. Now, there's lots of frameworks out there in the IT world. In the UK, we deal with Cyber Essentials. In the US, you guys deal with NIST. But essentially, they're all doing the same stuff. They're all looking for the same sort of controls. So when I talk about pieces in RMM here, you guys can apply that to your own framework, right? It's kind of all the same stuff, right? And we really need to talk about security as a layered approach. So people talk about it, defense in depth, right? So you've got, if you imagine networks, you've got outside there, you've got spam filtering happening in your mail provider. You've then got edge firewalls. You might have UTMs that are doing in-stream AV scanning. You've got then AV on the endpoints. You've got EDR solutions, VPNs, web filtering applications. You've also got Windows patching and OS patching, right, happening. And so this is kind of what I mean about it's a very complex space to manage. And really, internal IT departments and MSPs, ultimately, they all want to do the same kind of things, right? They all need to make sure AVs deploy to endpoints, they're patched, they're limiting the number of local admins and so on. So it's all kind of the same stuff, regardless of which space you're sitting in. So when we start talking about Datto RMM, we really then start to need to break that down into sort of blocks, into framework within its own package, right? So the first part really would be the discovery and the auditing side. We can't protect something if we don't know it exists. And so within RMM here, if I go to sites, now sites could be departments, customers, geographic locations, right? They're just logical groupings of devices. If I go to one of my sites here, I can set up a probe, a network node, and it's going to go off and scan the network for me, go find me some stuff that's out there. And the way we present that in Datto RMM then is we can either give you a list of things we've found, and you might try and onboard things from here, right? So you might deploy agents down to the endpoints. If it's network objects like a UTM or a firewall, we might start to try and monitor that using SNMP. But we're also going to try and discover the relationship between these devices and draw you a diagram. How does this stuff actually plug together on this network? And so this gives really, IT engineers at least a chance. How does this stuff, work within this environment? Who's related to who, right? So once we've got our RMM agent deployed and we understand the network structure, the next thing we're going to do then is we're going to audit the device, go find out what we've just been installed on. And so the auditing is completely automatic. And we're going to start to pull things like the operating system, the version of the OS, right? Its IP address information, the make, the model, serial numbers. But we're also going to start to look at other things like the installed applications on the device and their version strings, right? Because we all know that it's not only the OS that's vulnerable these days, it's also the installed applications. And in fact, the applications might be the primary cause of breaches, right? Not the OS itself. So we need to understand what's actually installed on these devices. And we can then start to apply policies over the top of that, right? How many local admins do we have? How many applications that are out of date? That kind of thing. So really the discovery and auditing is really the first place. Understand what we have there in the first place before we start. Now, well set up networks might separate guest and internal machines. You might discover that you've got clients out there that don't have well configured Wi-Fi networks, and you've got internal and guest devices on the same SSID, for example. You will only kind of start to discover that once you start to map these networks out. So it's a really good starting point. So when we start to apply monitoring over the top of this, then, well, we kind of touched on edge firewalls and UTMs, but we don't expect our MSPs to design all of this themselves, right? So the engineers know they need to monitor things like, let's say a Sophos gateway, for example. They know they need to do that, but they don't know necessarily what they need to monitor or how to do it. And so what we've done here is we've provided a whole bunch of best practice templates. And if we go look, we see we've got the template for this particular gateway. There's lots in here. I'm just picking this one because it was the top of my list there. And you see here we're pulling information about the device and its licenses. We might have a UTM, but is it doing anything? Has the license expired? Is it actually finding stuff on its way into the network? So it's important not just to monitor the endpoints, but that network infrastructure as well. Now, when we start talking about antivirus monitoring. We could say, is it up to date? Is it running? Right? Is it even present? Right? But then we need to dive into what AV do you have, because you might be supplying a specific version or a specific antivirus product to your endpoints. But if I turn up with a trial of a different AV product, it might pass the initial check. Have I got some AV? Is it working? Is it up to date? So I've passed those 3 checks, but it's not the AV you want me to have. And so we need to dig into that kind of level of monitoring as well, right? And we can apply some automation at that point. If I don't have the correct AV installed, my engineer is only going to deploy it anyway. So why don't we have the RMM do that, right? And automation starts to become the key to this. So once we've found out what's there, if it's incorrect, go deploy the correct version of the AV. If I'm running web filtering agents on my endpoints, VPN clients, do all my laptops have these installed? If not, deploy them. I don't want engineers physically involved, because as soon as we start having people do things, at some point somebody isn't going to do it. And we can't have that situation when it comes to security products. We need to make sure all the endpoints have what we expect them to have, and that they're working, and the correct versions, right? That's also important. So the fact I've got the AV product installed maybe isn't enough, right? We need to make sure it's the latest binary. Forget about the definition files at this point. Is it the correct binary, right? So we need to make sure they're happening. And that kind of brings us into more of a compliance piece. And so we might have a whole checklist of things. I expect all my laptops, desktop servers to have this bunch of core applications. We need to make sure they're patched. The third-party applications are up to date as well. And as I said, it doesn't really matter whether you're an internal IT department or an MSP at this point. We're responsible for the same things, right? So let's jump back to RMM. If we go down to patch management, the first part to patch management really is the discovery part. Again, so back to that auditing. What patches have we got installed? What are missing? And what do we do about it, right? So typically in RMM here, we would set up 2 policies, one for servers and one for workstations. Let's go audit those endpoints. Let's go find what's missing. But what I can do then is, from that list of missing updates, I can automate the installation. So I've got my site set up as customers, because I'm acting as an MSP right now. This might be a department. That could have been sales, marketing, whatever, right? But I can schedule the installs. So I can say, look, I want my updates to install maybe weekly on a Friday, right? Whatever we choose to do. And I can choose what kind of updates I want installing. So is it anything Microsoft are releasing? Or do I want to just focus on those critical and security updates? You've got complete flexibility when it comes to installing updates here and configuring the approvals. And so as you can see here, I can just go build myself an and/or clause around all this kind of stuff. I can exclude KB numbers, because we might be in a position where a certain KB might break our core application, right? Well, let's exclude it, right? So rather than just letting the machines go off and do their own thing, let's control the updates using RMM, because then we can start to report on this. And it's really coming back to the compliance part. How do I make sure we're actually doing what we said we'd do? And so dashboarding becomes very useful now. And so I can design dashboards inside of RMM to show me exactly the information I want to see. So right now I've got this set up to show me security type information. So my patching, my antivirus statuses, who's running no Windows firewall, right? Who's got the EDR agent installed, and so on. So it's really down to visibility now. But what we can do in Datto RMM here is we can automatically clone these dashboards. So I've built this one for security as a global dashboard. If I look back under my site I was using, you see we've cloned it right here. So if I click on this, you'll see the data is going to change. Now it reflects only that one particular site. And customers tend to like reporting and dashboards, because as an MSP, I can share this dashboard with my customer. Now they're going to only be able to see their own particular dashboard, right? Their own devices. But rather than relying on end of month, traditional kind of reporting, which incidentally is out of date the day after you sent it, right? I can now give you live access to data. And so as the client, you don't need to call me up. I don't need to explain what's going on. you can just self-service this kind of information. And we see really the market is going in this direction. Traditional reports still exist, but most MSPs, most internal IT departments are now moving away from fixed-term reporting into live data. So once I've got my dashboard, I know what's going on down there, I can start to take action on this. Now, I might automate some of this action. So these devices are needing a reboot. I might have reboot jobs just running in the middle of the night, right? Just go get them restarted for me. I might find some devices that are failing to install updates. Again, I can just have the RMM retry that, right? We might be running low on disk space. I'll have a different mechanism to deal with those. But the idea really is we want to stop engineers having to manually jump in and start to resolve this kind of thing themselves, because we don't have enough time, we don't have enough engineers, and these are the kind of things that start to slip, right? We haven't updated a machine for maybe a month, right? We haven't got time to deal with it. Let's have the RMM kind of fix that. So it removes that sort of point of failure, that potential exploitable thing. Let's just engineer that out of our environment using automation. We can turn our attention then to the other pieces that revolve around security. So as I said, how many local admins do I have? When was the last time I reset my local admin passwords on all of my endpoints? We might have a compromised password out there. We don't know. So let's use automation again. I can cycle all of my local admin passwords. I can even randomize the username, right? And I might do that daily. We've got some customers, they happen to be running in a university, and they're pretty scared that students will start to learn the combinations of usernames and passwords out there on endpoints. So they're cycling their usernames and passwords for the local admins. They're doing that daily. So if it's compromised, it's only one machine because they're all different. And of course, it's only compromised for a limited period of time as well. And that's all done through automation. There's no way a person could ever do that kind of thing. There's just too much to do, right? So all down to automation. We spoke about patch management for the operating systems. I focused on Windows there, but we can't forget Linux and Mac OS, right? They're also vulnerable too. It's quite a common thing to hear from Mac users that they're more secure. It's just there's less of them out there, so they're less of a target, but then as vulnerable really as Windows. There's just more Windows devices, so the bad actors tend to go for the larger sort of pool of devices, right? But recently we've seen exploits for Mac OS, right? We need to keep those being patched. So again, RMM is great for doing that, and Linux as well, right? So, and there's multiple flavors of Linux. Some are using apt-get, some are using yum update. From an RMM perspective, we don't really care. We're just executing scripts on that endpoint. Let's get them up to date, and again, schedule them, reboot them, whatever we need to get done there. And of course, you've got those third-party applications. Now, there's clearly lots of applications on endpoints. And what we've done is we've taken the most popular ones. And if we look at, again, policies, because pretty much it's all policy driven as a platform. If I go to software management, if I just grab a sample policy I've got here, we've got some options around timing. When am I supposed to do this? The most used one is immediately on detection. So as soon as a new version is available, I want you to download and install it. And that's become really, really popular after the recent Chrome exploit, the 0-day thing that was a couple of weeks ago now. Our customers that are running immediately on detection, that wasn't really a problem for them, because right down here we can set Chrome, Google Chrome, to automatically approve the new version and get it installed on the endpoints. Right? We can put this in manual approval mode, which is kind of auditing. So if we do find an out-of-date version of something, should we just alert the IT staff, right, that this is potentially an issue? Most of the time, though, again, down to that automation, people just want to get them fixed, right? Get them up to the latest versions. You might build in patch rings. We understand that, right? So not everybody can have the latest version immediately, right? Because we might need to test things like plugins and so on, especially when we start to talk about Office. You might have plugins in Outlook that you need to test, right? So you can build deployment rings. That's perfectly fine. You can do the same with the operating system patches as well. It really is flexible. How do you guys want to operate? But the key part really is we need to make sure these endpoints are up to date, whether it's operating system, third-party apps, have they got the correct AV installed, and so on. So that's kind of patching, and again, dashboarding would go with that as well. Now, if we start to move beyond antivirus, we start inside of Datto RMM. We get to ransomware detection and EDR. But before we talk about those, I just want to give you 3 examples of how I managed to defeat recently. I'm talking within the last couple of months, 3 well-known antivirus products. Now, I'm not going to name them because that's just unfair, but I shall tell you how I did it. And I'm doing this because I want you to realize that AV on its own is not enough, right? We all kind of know that, but I'm going to try and lay out why. So the first one, the first antivirus product, it had tamper protection enabled, but they unfortunately were using a reg key to determine whether tamper protection was enabled or not. So all I needed to do was change the reg key, then I could shut down the antivirus product. So at that point, it's an immediate fail, right? It's no longer helping me, and I can do what I like to the endpoint. So that was fairly straightforward to get past. The second one, a bit harder to deal with. It has tamper protection as well, so I could try and kill the process, but it's a lot harder. But I found that I could use PowerShell to drop a list of the excluded files and folders, right? So once I had a list of the excluded folders, I just ran my attack from one of those, right? Because the AV's told it shouldn't be doing real-time scanning on those, doesn't care what's being executed from them. So there was my attack quite happily running. An AV apparently is working as it was set up, right? So again, fairly straightforward to bypass. The third one, a little bit harder. Again, AV tamper protection was enabled, so I can't just try and terminate it anymore. But they didn't protect the update feature with tamper protection, so I was able to stop the update process and disable that. So, and they didn't protect the definition files either, right? So the detection rules. So I was able to delete those too. I wrote an entry into the run registry key, so I could restart my script once the machine was rebooted, and then just wait for the machine to restart itself or to restart. At which point the AV can't update itself. It has no definitions, so it has no way of detecting what I'm doing. So I was able to execute and start encrypting files. So there's 3 products there, all have flaws that I was able to bypass. I was able to turn off. So if I can do it, a bad actor can definitely do it, and probably more, right? So what I'm trying to say here is AV alone is not enough. And if we think about that stack we started to talk about, you've got spam filtering happening, you've got edge firewalls and potentially UTMs doing AV scanning as well as data's coming in. You've got the AV on the endpoint. If we make our way through all of those layers and we still execute, something has gone wrong somewhere. And if I can shut your AV down, there's nothing helping you on the endpoint. So that's when you kind of start to think about EDR solutions. Now, baked into RMM, we have ransomware detection. Now, ransomware detection is a halfway house between AV and EDR. You will always have AV on the endpoint, and you'll note that we're not trying to replace that AV. And as Datto, we're not even going to try and tell you which AV vendor to go for either, right? We're going to auto detect whatever AV you've got installed, and we can apply monitoring to it. So you guys will use whatever you think is the best AV. But we can layer across the top of that ransomware detection. And what we're doing here is we're really looking for evidence of files being encrypted. So regardless of what the AV is doing, did I just see some files being encrypted now? And it's really a true-false thing, right? And that's our trigger. So if I jump into an endpoint security policy we have here, if I look at my ransomware detection piece, what we're saying here is which disk should I look at on the endpoint? Well, there's no real reason I wouldn't say any disk, but you can make exceptions if you need to. But bear in mind what I just said about exceptions. You might not want to do that. Clearly, this is going to be a critical alert we're generating because we're actually seeing files being encrypted right now. So should we automatically isolate the device from the network? Now, what we're doing here is we're really changing the routing table. So the device is still going to check into RMM. Your engineers can still get to it. It just can't communicate with anything else on the local network. And we're going to stop and disable the workstation service as well. So any map drives that machine has got will be instantly dropped. And then we can go and try and terminate the process running the encryption. So as I said, think of this really as a second pair of eyes on the box. If the AV missed it for whatever reason, what can we do? Now, some of you are going to say, well, my antivirus product has ransomware detection built into it. It might have EDR capability as well, right? That's great. But if I shut down your AV, no one else is helping you. So really, that's the way you need to look at this, right? Let's assume the AV hasn't dealt with it. What else can we do? And that's really the angle. And that kind of brings us on then to full-on EDR. Now, EDR above sort of standard AV. Standard AVs are very good at true, false, yes, no, good, bad sort of detection, right? You might have advanced AV, which can do some behavioral analysis as well. And as I said, you might have that EDR piece baked into your AV. But as I said, if AV is not there anymore, if I've killed it, shut it down, made it go look somewhere else, right, then it's not helping you. So again, let's assume the AV isn't helping. It's been compromised in some way. So we need to start looking then at other behaviors on the box. Have I just seen some encrypted PowerShell being executed, base 64 encrypted PowerShell? Have I just seen new local admins being created? Has somebody just downloaded a copy of my local local security database and taking that off the endpoint? All this kind of behavior that a traditional AV might not care about, right? New run keys being created, that kind of thing. And again, if we go back to that endpoint security policy, right here, we have Datto EDR. It's baked right into RMM. Again, if I just click on edit right here, there's nothing really you need to set up. And I'll explain why in a second. But here we're saying, make this a critical alert. I might want to send emails out. I might want to use webhooks into Teams directly if we've got an alert. But as soon as I say apply this to my endpoints and hit save, it's going to deploy the Datto EDR agent to the endpoints. That's the only configuration you need to do. So what we've done here is we've taken what could be a very complex piece of software, EDR, right? By definition, it could be quite complex, and really boiled it down to, do you want it or do you not? And because we've used this deployment method, we can target only certain customers. If you guys want to wrap it up into a security offering, an enhanced security package, for example, we've seen clients do that. Or do you want to use it for your benefit as the internal IT, the MSP? Do you want to make sure endpoints aren't being compromised from sort of a non-AV kind of way, right? And the way we're doing this, the way we've made it really simple, is we've baked into EDR the MITRE ATT&CK framework rules. So they're still there. You can jump to an EDR console. Of course, I've been logged out because we've been idle for a while. And as you can see, it's all kind of protected on the front end. But here you have a full-on EDR console. So if you want to get into the weeds, how does this actually work? It's all right here. You can configure it. But out of the box, it's already configured. So really for small MSPs, for guys that don't necessarily have that level of expertise, you can just go ahead and deploy it out. You can see here from the dashboard, we can see the number of alerts we've got going on through EDR, the number of compromised endpoints, vulnerabilities, and so on. But it's really when we get to the policies that it gets quite interesting, because these are the rules. These are the how we define what is good and bad. And as you can see, this is already pre-set up for you. You can create your own rules, right? You might modify some of these rules, but essentially it's already configured for you. So we've taken what is quite a complex topic and boiled it down to essentially 2 tick boxes, right? Do I turn it on, and who do I apply it to? And we can push it out that way. Now, we haven't just come up with Datto EDR, one weekend, right? We actually purchased a company called InfoSight, and they're an existing EDR product. It was actually started by 2 guys that used to work for the US Air Force, and they've been doing cyber security work for a long time with the US Air Force. And when they left the Air Force, they went and created InfoSight as an EDR software provider. And Datto purchased EDR and just brought their product straight through and baked it into Datto RMM. So it's a well-known, it's a mature product, right? So when we start to layer that up, then you've got your standard AV doing good, bad, yes, no, true, false stuff. You've then got ransomware detection running across the top of that. And then you've got the EDR sitting, looking out for those other things like, process injection, memory injection, that kind of stuff that traditionally an AV is not really that interested in. And that all then comes back to dashboards, right? So we can jump back into RMM, into our dashboards, because at some point we need data out of this. So if I go back to that security dashboard, we're going to then present, who's got the EDR active, who's not active yet. Maybe we need to push that out to those endpoints. But we can also then start to look at the detections, right? So, what are we detecting out there on the endpoints? Have we seen incidents of ransomware? Have we seen the antivirus product ping, for different infections, or the EDR ping alerts for certain things? Now, a traditional EDR and AV can get very noisy, because there's all sorts of stuff it's capturing. Like I said, looking at encrypted PowerShell being executed, new run keys being added. There's loads of stuff that could be happening. So you could find yourself swamped with alerts, right? So what we've done is we've tried to compress that to a manageable sort of number for you guys, right? So here's a typical alert we get from EDR, and so it's pinged. There's something going on this endpoint. So we've got one alert, but you see there's 17 different events in here. And if I expand this, what we've got here now is the entire attack chain. So this is EDR has been noting what's been going on the endpoint. We might, again, apply some logic around this, some automation around this, right? Kill processes, delete reg keys, that kind of stuff, right? We might do that kind of thing. But this isn't an attack chain that's been happening. So here we see we've got base64 encoded PowerShell executing. And this is the rule that you'll find in EDR. So if you want to know how that got pinged, you just need to go look at that rule, and you'll find out what it's looking for. So we see a couple of a reg key being created there. Look, my volume shadow copies were being deleted. Now, if you think about how an AV would deal with this, well, they're all kind of normal behaviors, right? Encoded PowerShell might be not such a good thing to happen, but a new registry key being added, volume shadow copies being deleted. Well, administrators can do that, right? So nothing odd has happened from an AV perspective, but of course, EDRs are really interested in this kind of stuff. We've seen more PowerShell being executed here. Oh, look, the endpoint protection, the AV has suddenly been disabled using the command line. So this is what I mean about AV not being enough, right? So at this point, if AV was the only thing you had on the endpoint is gone. It's infected. It's too late. If the AV and the EDR are the same thing, and using those kind of workarounds I spoke about earlier, it's gone. It's too late. It's the same thing. It's been infected. Well, because we've got two separate products here, we've got AV and Datto EDR. Well, they might have killed the AV, but EDR is still going. We're still logging stuff, right? So there's my local security access database being downloaded, right, from the endpoint. So this is kind of why EDRs exist, and it's why you should really consider having different vendors for AV and EDR. I'd also go a stage further and say your UTM shouldn't be the same vendor as your desktop AV either, because if it's made its way past the UTM with in-stream scanning, there's less likely that the on-device AV is going to pick it up either, right? So ideally, you want to spread your vendors, give you 3 pairs of eyes on that rather than just one, with maybe different detection algorithms, but you've still got the same kind of detection happening. So splitting those up to different vendors, and that gives you really the ability to pick the best in the market. You might have, Sophos as a gateway. You might have a different AV product on the endpoint. You might have Datto EDR sitting across the top with ransomware detection as well, right? So all of those in the mix. And so, as I said, these are all complex events happening on the endpoint. We've got some download happening now. So this is probably the payload arriving on the endpoint, because there's nothing else to stop it apart from EDR at this point. And then, of course, that's executed, and the potentially the encryption starts. And at that point, we killed the process using the ransomware detection on the endpoint. But the point I'm trying to make here is we've taken that whole attack train. Rather than giving you 17 alerts, we've made one alert and said, look, there's 17 items in here of interest. And that way we're not swamping ticketing systems, mailboxes, Teams chats, whatever you guys want to output to. We're not going to just kind of spam those to death, right? Because once a security product becomes too noisy, it kind of loses its effectiveness. What is good or bad within this, this alert stack that I happen to have? So really, to start summing up, you really need to discover what's out there on your networks. As I said, if you don't know it exists, you can't protect it. And you also might have rogue devices. So bring your own device, work from home. Who knows what's on those devices, but you potentially let them VPN in to the network. You might have rogue laptops coming into the office, bring your own device into the office and joining the corporate network. You really need to segment that stuff off. You need to find out as to what's there, audit the endpoint, go figure out what operating systems exist. Have we got vulnerabilities on those third-party applications? Get those up to date. We don't just need to consider Windows devices. You need to also look at Mac and Linux boxes that might be sitting out there on the network. And Linux boxes could be anything. It could be a phone system, right, running Linux. If it might be there, it might be vulnerable. You might need to deal with it. You then need to apply monitoring across the top of that. And this is where your compliance piece comes into play. So once I get them up to date, I need to keep them up to date. And if any of this security software goes missing, so an end user might be wandering around with local admin rights, let's hope they're not, but it might happen. If they remove the web filtering agent or the VPN client, it needs to go back, right? So let's have an RMM put that back. RMM will never get bored reinstalling software, right? So let's have that compliance piece running. Let's have dashboards and reports. Let's find out globally what's happening out there. And then we also need the ability to look in individual sites. I said sites for me with customers, but they could be office spaces, geographic locations, right? Just local logical groupings of devices. Let's figure out what's actually happening there. Make sure tamper protection is enabled in your AV. Some AVs, would you believe, ship with tamper protection disabled by default. That's completely crazy. I think that's probably your first job, actually, after this call. Make sure tamper protection is actually enabled. Now, RMM can help you with that. We can go read whatever reg keys are out there or whatever config files you might have down the endpoint. You just need to tell us how to query that, right? And we can go look for that kind of stuff. We might even have it already written as an out of the box thing. But tamper protection, make sure that's working. And as I said, different if you can use different desktop AV products to EDR products to gateway products. You're increasing the chances of success if you use the same different products. You're increasing my chances as a bad actor of success if you use the same product. So try and vary your detection software out there. I think that pretty much covers in a very kind of highlighty way. We can spend hours talking about monitoring stuff, but I've tried to kind of give you a very sort of high level walk around why RMM is important from a security perspective, and also ransomware detection and EDR as well.
Yeah, that was great, and thanks for that conclusion at the end, because I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more, because I think I think what we're talking about here are SMBs primarily, who may not have a lot of staff or bandwidth to necessarily organize and deliver the best cybersecurity solutions they can. So if you wouldn't mind just reiterating again, I know you started by saying AV isn't enough, and I get that, but what are your recommendations, just in a kind of a stack, with regard to what an SMB should be thinking about for having a solution? And then, is it through MSPs? Is this something that they can do on their own? I mean, what are your kind of recommendations there?
Sure. So let's go from the outside in, right? So to get to my device, you've got to get through my email box, maybe my web browser, right? So we need to secure those first. We need an anti-spam, um, provider on the mailbox first of all to remove those initial threats, right? We also need to filter web traffic. It's not impossible for legitimate pages to be hijacked, right? And start spreading malware that way. So we need to make sure that when our end users don't end up at an infected pages. So when people talk about web filtering, they think of things like blocking Facebook or blocking YouTube or something like that. That's not kind of where we want to be. We want to be looking at is this site good or bad? Do I know it's infected, or do the algorithms know it's infected? Let's stop you getting there. Now some browsers have that built in already, but I'm using Chrome. You might be using Safari. The next person along is using, I don't know, a Firefox, right? It's impossible from a browser perspective to organize that. So we should do it at the DNS level, right? Let's stop you getting there, regardless of how we're trying to get there. Let's stop you getting there. So once you've dealt with the outside part, you then get to your firewall, your edge firewall. So this is the gateway to your network. And so we also need to be paying attention to that. Now, traditional firewalls are there to stop people breaking into your network, but some of them, especially when you start talking about UTMs, they can do in-stream scanning, right? In-stream AV scanning. So the traffic that's coming back to my endpoint from a website or wherever, does that contain malware, right? So let's look at that sort of side. Let's stop it before it gets to my endpoint. Once it's at my endpoint, of course, you've got then your traditional antivirus product, which is doing that good, bad, true, false kind of algorithm. You then maybe have ransomware detection and then EDR, looking for those things that your AV doesn't necessarily care about. So that's the kind of structure you really need to go through. Better to keep it out your network, but let's assume it's already in your network. What can I do at the endpoint level?
Yeah, that's and I think this is really something that people need to be thinking about, regardless of the size of business, because the bad actors don't care.
No.
And we've seen it time and time again, and I want to dig in on that a little bit more, because there are tools that are available that come kind of bundled, and I'm thinking primarily of something like an Intune, which comes essentially bundled in Microsoft 365. Yep. Can you talk a little bit about, I think a lot of people are using that right now as a mobile device management solution effectively. Can you talk a little bit about where that kind of hits its limits in terms of its ability to handle what's coming?
Sure. So Intune is it's a very good product, but it's a very siloed product. So if you're dealing with multiple networks, maybe multiple businesses, right? You probably end up with different instances of Intune. And if you want to make a change, let's say you want to change a detection rule in Windows Defender, for example. If you've got 50 businesses, you've got 50 copies of Intune, you've got to make that change 50 times. And as soon as you start adding complexity like that, and people are doing it, at some point, somebody's not going to do it. And what you thought was happening isn't happening anymore, right? So that's where really RMMs come into their own. Regardless of where these devices are, we make one change and apply it many times. And so you can guarantee that's actually the configuration on the endpoint. And that's kind of really where we see the differentiator between an Intune, which is a one-site, one-hit wonder, to an RMM, which is, I don't care where you are, you have my agent, and we'll just go and configure your endpoint.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, and I think Intune is certainly something we've seen gain a lot of market share with this type of company, because it is ultimately easy. It's an easy answer internally, right?
Right, but if you start to look at all the different Microsoft consoles, you've got Office 365, where you're dealing with your user mailbox kind of thing. You've got Intune. You might have compliance consoles somewhere else. You might have a different reporting platform somewhere else. Suddenly you've got 4 or 5 different browser tabs open just to do the same thing, right? And that's, RMMs are great for consolidating that kind of workflow as well.
So I want to dig in on ransomware detection because I think ultimately ransomware is the most serious threat, I guess, to an organization. Antivirus products that have ransomware protection built in versus an RMM. Can you kind of dig in on the distinctions there?
Yeah, so RMMs are not going to replace your AV, right? The AV is your line of defense. But ransomware detection in RMM against AV with built-in ransomware detection. So I'll take you back to that kind of example I gave you earlier, where if I disable your AV and that's doing the ransomware detection, nothing's helping you anymore. And so bad actors, the first thing they're going to do is try to remove the stuff that's going to stop them encrypting your device, right? So I said either sidestepping your AV and running from an unprotected location, or just completely terminating your AV. If it's one and the same thing, no one's helping you anymore, which is why you kind of need two pairs of eyes at least on that. Your AV deciding, yes, this is good or bad, true, false, that black, white, right? That kind of stuff. And then your ransomware detection acting independently. So if somebody shuts down your AV, ransomware detection is still there. And if we notice the behavior, files are being encrypted, I said we can terminate the process independently of what the AV is doing.
Well, and practically speaking, if they're both running, if the AV with ransomware detection is running and the RMM with ransomware detection is running, does that create conflicts? And I mean, does that need to be managed in general?
No, not at all. No. So in that scenario, whoever gets there first, right? So if the AV finds it and terminates it, or we find it and terminate it, either way is good. The end result is what we're after. In terms of conflict and CPU spikes and all this kind of stuff, modern endpoints are so powerful, you won't actually notice that there's more than one thing going on, especially if you're dealing with SSDs, right? They're really quick these days. CPUs spend most of the time idle, so adding an extra thing checking, is this good or bad, it makes no difference.
So we were speaking actually to the Datto US folks in a previous event, and one of the phrases they use is sometimes it's malicious and sometimes it's not, in terms of alerts. Can you talk a little bit about the levels of alerts? So one of the questions we had is what makes an alert critical? But I'm curious if you can just kind of share the distinctions that the system is making with regard to alerts and how to think about, not every alert is necessarily concerning.
Sure. So some are informational, absolutely. So I actually designed some of our basic built-in policies, right, inside of RMM, and it's a very good point. What is critical and what's not? So we took this approach, and I took this approach, right? If the end user is going to notice something is broken, or if it's security related, then that's critical. If it's something I would like to know, but nobody else notices, then that becomes informational low. So when you start to apply that to rule sets, low disk space, well, we might hit 70% used. No one cares. I might care because at some point we might get to 80%, some point we might get to 90%. So I might start capturing that data, but I don't need to act on it immediately. If we get to 95%, there's a good chance that that's going to hit 100%. The machine won't boot anymore. That's when we say that's a high priority alert. If we move over to the security space, my AV being out of date for 1 hour, okay, that's annoying, but it's not the end of the world. My AV being out of date for 6 hours, I need to do something about that, right? That's not correct. that needs to be fixed. And again, automation would play a good part in all of this, right? If we look at things that EDR might be detecting, well, as we saw earlier, things like base 64 encoded PowerShell being executed. No administrator is going to do that. No one in their right mind would encode PowerShell and then execute it on endpoint. That's going to be malicious. So we've got a good chance of saying that's bad behavior. Make that a critical alert, right? As an administrator, though, I might remove the shadow copies, from an endpoint. Again, that could be normal behavior, but if I see encrypted PowerShell, then my shadow copies are removed. Well, those two together become critical, because that's now an attack chain developing, right? So that's kind of it's hard to put down in words, but once you start looking at what's happening on an endpoint, what's normal and what's not normal, you can kind of start to gauge. Okay, well, that's the kind of behavior we don't want to see. At that point, it's critical. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and I think it lends itself to one of the other questions that we just got, which is around the challenges and bandwidth of a small team. And what they're saying is they've
Yeah.
looked at EDR in the past and found it complicated to set up. Can you explain a little bit more about the Datto approach to that sort of thing, and how you've kind of organized this to help mitigate that issue?
Yeah, exactly. And it is daunting especially if it's a small IT team, when someone says we need EDR, because they probably remember EDR from 2 years ago, where you have a big console with lots of boxes and squares, and it's just nothing's turned on by default. You've got to invent everything, and also you've got to deploy this to the endpoints too, right? You've got to make sure that this is actually out there working. So when you look at it like that, from that kind of lens, yeah, it's you're thinking hours and hours of work to get this done. So what we've done with Datto EDR is that it comes pre-configured best practices, right? Those MITRE ATT&CK framework rule sets, they're already set up. And within RMM, you just need to select the policy, turn it on, apply it to these devices, and as soon as you hit apply or go, it's going to deploy it automatically to the endpoints. It takes longer to talk about it than actually do it. Now, for those power users, you can still get in and modify the rule set, right? You can build your own rules, right? It's a complete EDR platform. But the vast majority of our client base really treat it as a set and forget. It's good enough out of the box. Just deploy it.
I think the challenge that we've seen, certainly, and quite frankly, we're a small business as well, is the number of solutions that you get and the number of consoles that you're looking at, and the levels of complexity that begin to kind of overwhelm the administration of it.
Yeah.
And patches. Can you talk a little bit about patches and how RMM deals with that? I know we talked about it at the intro, and I know it's a fairly specific feature, but can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So we all know we need to patch endpoints, right? And not only operating systems, but third-party applications as well, right? That has to happen. And we hear quite a lot that there's no good time to patch something. Laptops spend most of the evenings offline, right? They're in people's bags, they're on desks powered down, that kind of stuff, right? So if you think about the end goal, I need to patch these endpoints. We can use RMM then to bring that to the middle of the day. So if we look at the sort of use of an endpoint, if you imagine your own endpoint, there's a busy period in the morning when you get into work, so maybe between 8 and sort of 11, it's quite busy. Then you might go to lunch, 12 till 1, say, or 1 till 2, somewhere in that range, where your endpoint is not doing very much at all. And then it gets busy again. And then maybe 6 o'clock, it's powered down, and that's never seen again until the next day, right? So we can use RMM then to start patching these endpoints in the middle of the day when we know they're quiet, no one's using them. And by automating patching, you're actually satisfying quite a lot of those framework kind of tick boxes that we were talking about earlier, the Cyber Essentials or NIST framework. If you're running to a sort of a framework of controls, automating patch management, third-party apps and OS, gets you quite a long way down that journey. And I say by automating in the middle of each day, servers are different, right? We're talking about workstations right now. But automating patching and then also reporting on that. I need at some point to track the effectiveness of patching as well, and that's what those dashboards come into play.
Well, so I think as we're kind of coming to an end here, I always like to get some advice. I think we know there are a lot of people who are kind of whistling past the graveyard here on the IT side, hoping for the best with what they already have, knowing that they need something a little more robust. So while we have you, I'm curious from all of your perspective, what advice would you offer to those folks right now who are sitting there in kind of a semi-guilt, thinking about that next step, but also with the hesitancy around, do I really want to take on this next level of complexity? I mean, what would you suggest they be thinking about, and also what should be their kind of next step?
There's lots you can do right now just by looking at your own environment, right? So does every endpoint that you're aware of have antivirus installed? Is tamper protection enabled? That's kind of the one key part, right? Are we patching these endpoints effectively? So do they have a patch management regime set up, or is Windows dealing with its own patches, right? You need to kind of figure this out. Kind of what is your baseline? Where are we starting from is really the point. So once you understand where you are, and local users having admin rights as well, that's ridiculous in this day and age, right? But once you understand where you are, you have something to build from, right? So backups is the next thing. If you're dealing with, or if you tell me that OneDrive is where you back your data up to, that's ridiculous. Malware can encrypt. I was going to say I can, but malware can encrypt OneDrive, right? So that's ridiculous. That's not a backup, right? That's just somewhere else to store your stuff, right? So you need to make sure your data is being backed up, because really businesses run on data. You can replace a laptop. You just go down to the nearest store and buy a new one. But if you lose your data, effectively you're going to struggle to run your business anymore. You might even go out of business. So I said that's kind of your start point.
Yeah, good advice. And there's a lot more that you can learn from talking to a company like Datto, and we would encourage you to do so. We would also encourage you to check out everything that we're covering with regard to endpoint protection, monitoring, and really all of cybersecurity across all the sites that we have here at Solutions Review. And by all means, these things are oftentimes very beneficial. Even if you don't end up engaging necessarily with the solution, reach out and have a conversation with Datto and companies like that, because you're going to learn a lot. You're also going to be able to kind of crystallize your thinking around what you need to do ultimately to protect your organization and keep it out of all the risk that is out there and growing. So Matt, this was great. Thanks very much for the time today. Very much appreciated.
No problem. It's good to talk to you guys.
Well, there you have it. Another solution in our spotlight. We want to thank Matt and Datto for that fine presentation, and we appreciate your attendance as well. Until next time, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review. Thanks for watching.